talk the day when we got back from spring break, but we shouldn't have been worried. And I think of all the speakers that we could have the day after we returned, this is definitely a poignant talk that we'll be looking forward to. I'm Teresa. I'm the Interim Director for the Graduate Program in Food Systems and Faculty in Anthropology. And before we get started introducing Eric, I just wanted to give out some of our thanks for the sponsors for this talk. First, thanks to Allison Spain, who is an amazing, amazing person at giving logistics for traveling speakers, so that was really helpful. This talk has been sponsored by the Food Systems Graduate Program. Thanks, Allison. The Food Systems Graduate Program, Plant Soil Science, and the Anthropology and Livelihoods Collaborative. And my colleagues in that collaborative have been really instrumental in bringing Eric here as well, including Holt-Gimenez, who unfortunately was traveling during this talk. We also received support from the Gund Institute, Nutrition and Food Science, Community Development and Applied Economics, and the Department of Anthropology. And so I think that is a good showing of how wide-reaching Eric's work is and how much of an appeal he has across disciplines. So Eric Holt-Gimenez has been the Executive Director of Food First since 2006, and at Food First, his research and writing has looked at various elements of the food system, including the global food crisis, agroecology, the Farm Bill, the expansion of agrofuels, land issues, racism in the food system, and social movements for food justice, agroecology, food sovereignty, farm justice, and just a small thing called capitalism. So lots of small topics. Most recent books are A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, Understanding the Political Economy of What We Eat. As soon as I finished and reviewed that book, the second book in recent years came out, which is Can We Feed the World Without Destroying It, which is the title for today's talk. Eric has a master's in international agricultural development from UC Davis and a PhD in environmental studies from Santa Cruz. He's taught at Berkeley, Santa Cruz, Boston University, and the National Gastronomic University in Piacenza, Italy. And we're really happy to have him at UVM for the second time. He spoke at the Food Systems Summit a few years ago, and I'm lucky enough to introduce him for the second time. So that's exciting. So for me, I've been really inspired by Eric's work since I was a graduate student, and I think one of his unique contributions to food scholarship and food system scholarship is his always enduring connection of small, local, regional issues to large-scale processes. And I think that that's a really important contribution to the conversations that we need to be having about food systems. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. You're not here to listen to me, and he's got a lot of things to say. So welcome to Eric.
Well, thank you, Teresa. And thanks everybody for showing up. I don't think I ever got back after the first week after spring break, so when I was in school. So thank you for your sacrifice. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is kind of my farewell tour, because what Teresa didn't mention is that I'm retiring. After 13 years at Food First. It's been an extraordinary experience. I feel very privileged to have been there. But I'm going to be moving on a little more slowly to some other things, still associated with Food First. So this is probably my last lecture, so I have a lot to say, because I may never say it to you again. Let's see. I can work it with this, right? Great. So, some of you who may have heard me 2 years ago are going to say, oh, he's saying all the same things. I am, but in a different way. But I will introduce the talk the way I like to introduce all the talks, which is about food first. So we're people's think and do tank, which is a long moniker, but basically means that we do research around ending the injustices that cause hunger, but we work with social movements, and we also do work on the ground to the extent that we can, not just research and writing. And I guess our theory of change, if you wanted to call it, is that change comes about through the power of social movements. So we try to both amplify the voices of the social movements and inform the general public and social movements about what's going on with the food system. We were started over 40 years ago by an extraordinary woman named Frances Moore Lepay. How many of you read Diet for a Small Planet? Good. It's kind of generational, but not completely. So, Frankie is still an extraordinary woman. But think about, a young graduate student back in the early 70s, looking into the issues of hunger right after Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, and the Club of Rome had met, and also produced a fairly Malthusian analysis of what was wrong with the world and how we were eating ourselves out of house and home. And all of this was used to argue that we need, you can move that, to argue that we needed to increase food production, we needed to double food production, because 1 in 7 people were going hungry around the world. And we were pushing our food system past its limits, and we had to double the amount of food over the next generation, or we were all going to die. That's the way it was pitched, and quite obviously the poor and the hungry were going to die, but the way Malthus frames things was the way it was framed by Ehrlich and Club of Rome and everybody else. It was going to be sort of this catastrophic crash of the civilization. But when Frankie looked at things, she realized, and remember, this is before the internet. Forget Facebook and Instagram. It's like before internet, where you wrote a letter to somebody and asked them for the research, and then they sent it back to you. And, the library did the same thing. Wrote a letter to call for books and papers and whatnot. But she found pretty clearly that there was more than enough food in the world to feed everybody. In fact, it was 1.5 times more than enough food for every man, woman, and child on the planet. So clearly, hunger could not be the result of scarcity. What was the cause of hunger? Well, she said it was poverty. People could not afford to buy the food which was being produced. And then she began to ask, well, why are people poor? Not just that they are, and you have to sort of give them money or give them a job, but why are they poor? And that sort of, set her off on this quest of food first. She established the think tank with the royalties from her bestseller, and sort of didn't look back. And since that time, Food First has gone through a number of different iterations, going from the cause of hunger is poverty to, and the cause of poverty is injustice, and the solution to injustice are, social justice movements. So the answer to the question of how do we end hunger. Am I doing something wrong? There we go. Maybe I just have to be patient. So fast forward 43 years, and I'm just going to read the first paragraph here from this book that we did with Polity Press. I like this book. It's a tiny thing, and I tried to make it as straightforward as possible. How times have changed. 50 years ago, few doubted that a combination of high-yielding hybrids, chemical fertilizers, powerful pesticides, extensive irrigation, and big machinery would make hunger a thing of the past. We had but to spread the green revolution around the world, and modern technology would give us a cornucopian abundance of food, as long as we controlled population growth. Now we're not so sure. In some places and for some people, the ability to produce enough food remains life's central challenge. But when we look at the global food system, we see a whole new set of problems, more related to overproduction than to the top challenges associated with scarcity of food. For example, chronically low prices paid to farmers, inordinately high levels of food waste, and the repurposing of grains and oilseeds for feed and fuel, rather than for food, are all a reflection of systemic overproduction. The high indices of hunger and malnutrition among the world's peasant farmers are also a reflection of oversupply. Large industrial farms with massive market power are producing vast surpluses and monopolizing land and resources, driving these small farmers into bankruptcy and hunger. We've gone from questioning our capacity to produce enough food to questioning the way we produce it. And even though the rate of global population growth has leveled off and we're producing more food than ever before, nearly a third of the world's people presently suffer from hunger and malnutrition. Feeding them and the world's projected population of 10 billion by 2050 has become a high-profile challenge for governments, multilateral institutions, relief and development programs, big philanthropy, and even the Fortune 500. Sorry. So this year, in their 2019 report on the state of food in the world, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, was very concerned because it appeared as though over the last few years, hunger was rising again. That hunger had been going down. We had been not meeting, but getting closer to the Millennium Development Goals. And now, suddenly, it's rising again to 821 million. That's in this year's report. And the day before yesterday, I was at the University of Southern Maine, giving a talk similar to this, and prior to my talk, someone from the Food and Agriculture Organization got up and showed this slide. He showed the slide with the orange and gray lines, not with the green line. I've added that. Because that's what the 2017 report says, or the 2019 report says, is that hunger has been going down since 2005, but since 2015, suddenly it started to go up again, ever so slightly. And if you look at the gray line, that's the percentage of hunger. We're up at 11% again, after having gotten down to 10.6% of the world's population being hungry. And the orange line are the absolute numbers, and we're up to 821 million. But if you go back year by year and read the reports of the FAO, then you can construct that green line. See, that's what they were saying at the time. They've revised all their past estimates. Curiously enough, in that revision, they left out the 2008 food price crisis, where you can see the spike in the green line there. They also left out the 2010 food price crisis, but they left that out in the report in 2010 as well. But there should be another spike up there. Now, why would the FAO do that? Why would you massage the data backwards? Well, it turns out it had to do with trying to meet the Millennium Development Goals, which we were not meeting. And they did a number of different things, like backdating the base year and going from full numbers to percentages and a lot of things. But mostly what they did was they changed the way we measure hunger. Because for the FAO, someone is hungry if for 12 months out of the year, or for 11 months out of the year, you get less than 1,600 or 1,900 calories a day. Then you're hungry. Too bad for you if you were hungry for 10 months out of the year, you don't get counted. And what about that calorie count? Does anybody count calories? Anybody on a paleo diet or something like that? Or those diets where you try to make yourself hungry all the time, so you release, I don't know, endorphins or whatever it is. So, 1,600, 1,900 calories, that's really good if you are, I don't know, a university student sitting behind a computer and you don't do any physical activity. You'd probably be all right. But who are the hungry people in the world? They're not university students. Actually, I take that back. Some of the highest levels of food insecurity are within university students. I take it back. But in terms of the calories that you need, farmers are the hungriest people in the world. And laborers are the hungriest people in the world. And they need a lot of calories, particularly women farmers, who are most of the world's farmers, are women, and many of them are nursing. So they're going to need at least 4,000 calories a day, if not more. So if you actually measure hunger realistically, you find that, looking at these figures, it's not that 821 million people are going hungry, or even 1 billion people are going hungry. It's more like 2.5 billion people are going hungry around the world. And if we go back, and this is a graph which the FAO published in right after the food crisis, the 2008 food crisis. They published it in 2009, and then they did say that over 1 billion people were going hungry, not like today. So even if we assume that, let's just assume, okay, the absolute isn't true, but the proportions are correct. Well, where are all the hungry people? They're in Asia and the Pacific. We don't hear much about them, though. I mean, Bill Gates and the FAO and the World Bank, everybody's talking about Africa. Let's end hunger in Africa. You know, sub-Saharan Africa is hungry. You've got to bring the Green Revolution to Africa. They didn't have a Green Revolution. Now it's Africa's turn. That's the phrase, Africa's turn. And, you know, politicians and billionaires have been sort of jumping on this bandwagon to be the ones that finally end hunger in Africa. Why are we talking about Africa? Why aren't we talking about Asia? We should talk about Africa, but why aren't we talking about Asia? Well, I can tell you very clearly. It's because Asia already had a Green Revolution, and they still are going hungry. Africa has stumbled with the Green Revolution for decades. But Africa still represents the biggest market for fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, high-yielding variety seeds, GMO seeds. The market in Asia is already closed up. So this really has much more to do with market expansion than it has to do with hunger. And what kind of market expansion are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the Green Revolution sort of on steroids. Because in the beginning, the Green Revolution was about finding new markets for fertilizers and pesticides. We had saturated the markets in the global north, and we need to find places for all these products. So we sort of had to invent hunger in the global south, which was fairly easy to do by destroying the food systems of the global south, and in order to sell these products and save them from hunger. And this was really led by publicly funded research and credit from public banks and subsidized markets with public money. That's how it was spread. It wasn't the magic of the marketplace that cracked open the world for the Green Revolution. And it completely transformed the global south. Took peasant food systems and modernized them, which meant that it had to kick most of the peasants off the land to make way for these new big systems. And yes, there's always a stage in the beginning of the Green Revolution where the fertilizers are free, and the seeds are free, and the credit is free, and you know the markets are there, and then suddenly things begin to go awry. And all those things begin to disappear, and so the bigger players end up taking over, pushing the smaller players out. I was in Latin America at the time, saw it with my own eyes, and where did they go? Well, they went to the cities, to the slums, but they also went to the agricultural frontier. And so the tremendous gains in production, which we see through the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s because of the Green Revolution, before it ran out of steam, were in part because of these new inputs, which were very expensive, very energy intensive, very capital intensive, very water intensive, but they did produce more overall. Not in terms of pounds per acre necessarily, but overall, they did produce more. But production really went up because the amount of land under production increased, because as peasants were displaced, they went to the agricultural frontier, they went up on the hillsides, they cut down trees, they were searching nutrients, and they grew food. And in Central America, where I was, they basically produced half of all the increase in food at the cost of the forests and the soils on the hillsides. So that runs out of steam, both ecologically, environmentally, and in terms of markets. That whole model runs out of steam by the late 80s. And in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, you get sort of, the neoliberalization and the privatization of everything. Did I say it right? Neoliberalization and the privatization of everything. And the introduction of GMOs, the next new big technology which is going to save the world from hunger. But there's very little public funding for this now. And while it is built on the architecture of public institutions like the Centers for International Agricultural Research, really these technologies are being extended to those who can afford it, who are not most of the farmers in the world. And I call that the gene revolution. So when they say technology is the answer, this is the technology they're talking about. It's technology that you buy. That's the technology that they're talking about. And you always hear sort of the same trope, which is the same thing I heard when I was 20, which is the same thing that Frankie heard when she was doing her research, which is we have to double production because over the next generation, because we have to feed an increasing world population. So now we hear that by 2050, we've got to produce 100% more food or 70% more food. It varies depending on who says it. Or what, or we're all going to die, something like that. And these increases in production have to come from efficiency improving technology. So when they say that, that's a key word for capitalist agriculture. It's not efficient in terms of energy, it's not efficient in terms of water, it's not efficient even in terms of pounds per acre, but it isn't efficient in terms of moving capital through the food system and the expansion of agricultural capital. And there are some, what I call the golden assumptions behind this. One is that scarcity is the cause of hunger, which we know is not true, but this gets repeated over and over again from people who know better, like the FAO. And that these chemical-intensive monocultures, corn, soy, wheat, and rice, are more productive than the diversified polycultures, which they are displacing. Even the USDA has done studies to show that that's not true, but repeats the same mantra. Also, that agriculture necessarily destroys biodiversity. This is very important. That agriculture is destructive. Well, it is. Industrial agriculture is very destructive. So the idea is that let's make it as efficient as possible. Let's be climate smart about it. Let's do sustainable intensification. Let's use precision agriculture and produce as much as we can on the smallest plots of land as we can. And that way we won't have to encroach on the rest of the biosphere. And we can save our forests and our marshes and our wetlands and our prairies and whatnot. There's a lot of problems with that assumption. Most of all, it's never been proven. And it's because of things like the Jevon paradox. In fact, when you lower the cost of production, you basically incentivize the expansion of production. And the problem isn't the model. The problem is not the model of chemical-intensive agriculture. It's just the inefficient application of these inputs, not the rates of expansion, which are the problem. Well, first of all, with the first assumption, it's not true that hunger is due to scarcity. Because if you look at that green line, that's food production per capita. Now this just goes back to 1990, but you can take that green line back. I have more slides. You can take it back to 1960. And it basically is the same. That basically we've been producing, continue to produce, 12% more food per capita every year. That means every one of us should have gotten at least 12% more food. Everybody on the earth. New people being born as well. So it's per capita, so it doesn't matter if more people are being born. But the problem is that undernourishment has not changed. If you look at the yellow dots, they're flat. So even though we keep producing more food, people stay undernourished. And why is that? When you look at the green diamonds, they're flat too. That's poverty. So basically the food system has been incapable of eliminating poverty. and for that reason they can't eliminate hunger. Call this up the down staircase. This is, if you look back at the price of food, this is the food price index, and we started measuring it in 1900. So if you look back at the price of food, it was going up until about 1920, just before World War I, and then it crashes, and then it goes sort of flat for this interesting period, which is basically from the New Deal all the way up to almost to the Green Revolution, to the 1960s. You see this period of stability in the food price around the world. And what's happening, there's a tremendous period of accumulation of wealth because the food system is spreading. The price paid to farmers is relatively stable, historically. And you're getting a lot of accumulation of wealth. And then you get the Green Revolution, and suddenly the price goes way down, with the exception of the 1974 oil crisis, and because the whole system depends on oil, the price spikes. But basically it's going down. So what's happening there? This is a function of oversupply. That's why the price goes down. And if you look back earlier, why does the price stay the same? Well, it's not necessarily because we weren't producing enough, but it was because we were controlling oversupply. And we were ensuring a good price. So that means there was supply management, right? And there was a thing called a parity price. Farmers got prices for their products which covered their cost of production and gave them a decent livelihood in general. Until 2008, and suddenly see this huge spike in the food price index. I pasted on a red line there. It goes beyond anything we've ever seen before in the history of the index itself. So there was a lot of words for that. They called it a tsunami. Over a billion people went hungry kind of overnight. Governments fell. There were riots around the world, food riots, in places where you expect them, like Haiti, but in places where you wouldn't expect them to, like Italy and Milwaukee. And it was because the price of food was up beyond what people could afford. There was plenty of food. Even in Haiti, there was plenty of food in Haiti when the people rose up and threw the prime minister off the island. Food was sitting in a warehouse. He was incapable of giving it to the people because of the agreements with the USDA on PL 480 food, the food aid which we give. You have to sell it, you can't give it away. So they were not just rioting, they were rebelling against that very unjust system. And they ran a bomb off the island. At the core of this, I think, is what we call the agrarian transition. And it engages a crisis and a contradiction in terms of labor and in terms of ecology or environment. And this is actually very old. It is first sort of studied by someone at the bottom here who said, all progress in capitalist agriculture is progress not only in the art of robbing the worker, but of robbing the source of all wealth. Obscure philosopher. So labor, in terms of labor, we have a crisis of accumulation and overproduction. In other words, too much is being produced and it can't get sold. Food, remember, our food system is not about need. A lot of people need food. It's about demand. If you don't have money to express your need, in terms of a market demand, you're out of luck. You need some dense social networks to get you through. And so the primary crisis in agriculture has to do with this crisis of overaccumulation, which in agriculture is really very bad because of its seasonality. Because farmers have to put in all this investment just to get a seed in the ground, a lot of high fixed costs, high labor costs, high cost for materials, factors of production. And then they have to sit around and pray. Well, they don't sit around, but they pray for 6 months until you get a harvest, and then you hope you get paid enough to cover your cost of production. And if you don't, rather than cutting back, since you borrowed all the money to do this, the next year you have to grow even more. So the problem is that you didn't get a good price for your food because there was too much of it. So the next year you grow more of it. And then what's going to happen? That's the crisis of overproduction. And this befalls agriculture more than other industries which are much more flexible. And of course, agriculture is often based on extractivism, cutting down forests, opening up new land, on mining the soil, type of thing. And extracting labor from workers under exploitative conditions, as we do with immigrant labor today, and as we do with small farmers today. But this creates problems with the environment, which in part is called the metabolic rift, which means that the nutrients that you grow in the countryside get shipped to the city, get consumed, and then flushed down the toilet and out to sea, or into a landfill. So they're not being returned. So that's this metabolic rift, and it basically means the rift between the environment and the system of production, right? So you can see that there are other expressions of this in terms of using too many resources, in terms of all different kinds of pollutions, of nitrates and whatnot. And global warming would be an example of modern metabolic rift. I was reading a very interesting article this morning in my hotel by a reporter named Chelsea Edgar, who writes in this magazine called 7 Days. It was really very well done. So she goes out onto a farm, onto the Voorsteveld farm, these Dutch immigrants. And it's a fair-sized farm. You know, their total herd is about 2,300 cows. They milk 1,300 cows. That's normal. The three brothers inherited the farm from their dad back in '98 when there were only 400 cows. It was a tremendous expansion. And Chelsea says that, you know, Vermont's dairy industry is worth about $2 billion. And then it's grown from 137,000, or it's dropped from 137,000 to 126,000 cows. And the number of dairies has also dropped significantly. That would reflect the general case of dairies, as you see in the graph. When I grew up on a farm, there were, you know, over 650,000 dairies. And now we have less than 40,000, or we have a little over 40,000 dairies. So what's happening is that the overproduction of milk makes it difficult to stay in business because the price bottoms out. And so the three brothers at what is probably one of your largest farms here in the state with 23,000 cows. That's the average, by the way, in California. I'm not trying to, elevate California because these dairies are terrible. But that's just average for us. We have way bigger dairies than that. This is probably one of your bigger dairies. Or it is one of your bigger dairies. And they're like, to stay in business, we probably have to get bigger. And they would have to add another 1,000 cows or so to be able to buy the new robotic technology, which means they could let go of all their immigrant workers that they have. But that'll cost them around, $3.5 million. So you can see here, this is part of the agrarian transition, that as capital makes more and more inroads into agriculture, the small farmers fall away, the larger farmers are concentrated, and the whole thing gets capitalized, and farmers become more and more and more leveraged. So they may have to do this to stay in business, but that's no guarantee they're going to stay in business. They're still competing with California, and now we're going to be competing with China. How big do you think those dairies are going to get? So it's this condition of overproduction. Way too much milk, no control over supply, and no parity pricing that forces farmers to get bigger and bigger. So this is really evident in the 2008 food price crisis, where 1 billion people were going hungry, but it was a time of record harvests for the world, and a time of record profits for Archer Daniels Midland, Monsanto, Cargill, and the retailers as well, like General Foods. This is true across the board. All big monopoly retailers were making record profits, while 1 billion people, I would say probably 2 billion people, were going hungry. And they made so much money they didn't know what to do with it. They literally did not know where to put it. They had a crisis of accumulation of money because we had a recession, there was nowhere to invest it. So this is where you begin to see a lot of people investing in land and the financialization of land, because this money has to keep moving. Here's the crisis. There's 2008. There's the food price index. One is adjusted for inflation, the blue one. Doesn't matter. Or the black one. So you can see that in 2008 it spikes, and it spikes again in 2011. 2011 isn't shown on the FAO's graphs. Those red lines are the frequency of food riots. So what you can see is that as the food price index increases, it passes a threshold somewhere between 200 and 180, where you get food riots in countries which don't have safety nets. Right? 2011, that's the Arab Spring, you see there. Those food riots. So you can see where it's incredibly destabilizing, which really concerned world leaders. Here's another set of graphs. So there's the red line again. There's our peak in 2008, and there's the peak again in 2011. But the blue line, which is the retail price. So the red line is the wholesale price, blue line is the retail price, and you can see that it increases with the wholesale price. Makes sense. The price on the world market goes up, the price in the store is going to go up. But then when the price on the world market goes down, the price in the store stays high. This is called gouging. And this is what the retailers did. So you can begin to see sort of the politics around hunger and food, because in the next slide, those are the shares of Monsanto's stock. So the value of Monsanto's stock goes up as people go hungry, and it goes down as they are fed. So what happens? That means that people are selling off Monsanto stock. You don't want that. So they need another food crisis to pump that price up again so that the value of the stock goes up. And now they've sold out to Bayer, poor Bayer, because now you've got all these lawsuits. But the point being that this is part of the financialization of our food. There was a lot of talk about the proximate causes of the food crisis. Sort of accusations by George Bush against India and China for trying to eat meat like they were Americans. And yes, it's true that there were some low-grain reserves, but no one asked why we had low-grain reserves after overproducing food for a half century. And higher oil prices, yes, of course. But really, all these just sort of bumped the price up a bit until we get to a certain point, and then the commodity index funds begin to speculate with the price of food. And that's what pushes it up behind anything we've ever seen. And this is because of, 2 decades of deregulation in our banks and financial institutions. We allow them to do this. But the root causes are that we have a very vulnerable food system, which is monopolized by just a handful of grain traders, seed and genetic engineering monopolies, and retail and distributed monopolies. And something like over 90% of the world's commercialized crops are just like five crops. And amongst those, just a handful of varieties. So you can see that this really leads to a very top-heavy system, which is vulnerable to economic and environmental shock. Now, I talked about the economic problems and the financial problems, but the environmental problems have been massive. Overproduction basically contributes to a loss of over 75 billion tons a year in soil, maybe 10 trillion and a half tons of ecosystem services. We're drawing down all the fossil water in the aquifers. Last year we lost our main aquifer in California, lost it for good. At the height of the drought, we're still exporting almonds, exporting water to China, and our aquifer collapsed. We've lost 90% of the world's agrobiodiversity. We have, the big dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. 40% of food is wasted. And then we get to, greenhouse gases. That nearly a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases are due to industrial agriculture, if not more, depending on whether or not you take into consideration land use changes. That's second only to energy. And these are the number of extreme climate-related disasters. You can see they've gone up. So agriculture both contributes to climate change and is a major sort of victim of climate change. Basically, this is the nature of our food regime. And if you're not familiar with that term, think of all of the institutions and all of the rules which govern our food on a global scale. So today's corporate food regime, those institutions would be the big monopolies, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Food Program, the USDA, USAID, and big philanthropy like Bill Gates. They determine the rules. And you think about the rules, like the rules would be the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a rule for the world. No one gets to vote on it, not even us. So Farm Bill is a main pillar of late capitalism. They have it protected by layer and layer of committee. They're not going to let a democracy mess with it. And yet it sets the price for grain at the world level. Right? So that's the food regime. This corporate food regime has a history, has a long tail. The first food regime was a colonial food regime. We know what that was based on. Conquest, genocide, expansion, exploitation. But the whole point was to get the flow of resources and food going from the global south to the global north, so that the north could industrialize, so that the south subsidizes the industrialization of the north with cheap food, cheap resources, cheap labor. And then what's called the Keynesian food regime, that stable period I was showing on that graph, where food is part of programs with public goods, there's regulation, there's supply management, and then the introduction of the Green Revolution. Things have gone so well, we've got all this great machinery now, we've got to export it. And that's where we get into the neoliberalism of today, the 80s and 90s, where all of the public programs in the global south are dismantled by the World Bank and the IMF. You have the privatization of public goods, the removal of all tariff barriers so we can get our grains down there. We get them to dismantle their marketing boards, we get them to dismantle their grain reserves, we get them to grow anything but food, non-food exports, right? So they can pay their debts with dollars that they've got on the world market. And basically that's where you reverse the flow of food. The flow of food, if it was going from south to north, now it's going from north to south, making the south dependent upon the north for its food. So when the food prices go up in 2008, all these people starve because their food systems have basically been destroyed. These structural adjustment measures, which were agreements signed with the World Bank and the IMF, people rebelled against those things. After a couple of years, wait, we don't want this. We want our grain reserves back. We want our public institutions back. We want our public goods back. We don't want our money, our currency devaluated. And they voted out their presidents and political parties and whatnot. So very quickly, the global food regime moved to establish a new trade regime with the World Trade Organization and free trade agreements, in which those structural adjustment policies are cemented into international treaty where citizens cannot get to them. And it doesn't matter who you vote in and out, you've got a treaty there, and that is it. And these treaties basically ensure overproduction here in the north, which we then later come along and subsidize, because prices are too low for farmers because of the overproduction. And then we dump our surplus in the global south through different means, either directly through markets or through food aid. The results of this have been catastrophic. The global south used to be not only self-sufficient in food, but they used to export food $1 billion a year. Now they import over $1 billion a year. Industrial agriculture, again, nearly a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases, but uses up 80% of the fresh water. We've lost 3/4 of our crop diversity. And the cost of 20 years of trade liberalization in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has been almost $3 billion, about the amount they received in aid. So we're subsidizing the trade regime with aid. And of course, after NAFTA was signed, the North American Free Trade Agreement, very quickly, over 1 million Mexican smallholders went bankrupt because we dumped our grain on their markets. And that's where you begin to see the beginning of these huge, massive migrations out of the countryside. the cities into the United States. But I think that one of the biggest losses over the last 30, 40 years of neoliberalization, the privatization of everything, sort of been the privatization of us. We've lost our public sphere. The market makes all our decisions. You know, public sphere is where we come together and we make decisions on the basis of debate and on what we think is right. We don't get to decide that anymore. Now it's the market that decides that. And if the market decides, you know, free market, that just means that whoever has the most market power gets to decide. And that's what the monopolies are doing today. And this loss of the public sphere, I think, has a deep psychological and social effect on all of us. I mean, I went, not being particularly brilliant, I went all the way through school and all the way through grad school on the basis of scholarships. I finished my undergrad with a whopping debt of $2,000, which I owed to my dad and my uncle, and I paid off over the course of 10 years or something like that. And you know, here at public universities in this country, students are racking up $40,000, $50,000 of debt for a liberal arts degree. That's the loss also of the public sphere in our public goods. So there was an assessment by the World Bank actually put this team together. About 300 scientists had looked at the issue for about 3 years, called the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, Knowledge and Technology for Development. And this is their conclusion, that we've really got to change everything. Or we are looking at social breakdown and environmental collapse. Funny enough, they also found that GMOs were irrelevant to ending poverty or hunger or climate resilience. And they also find that the free trade agreements were detrimental, actually, that most of the benefits went to the northern countries, and poor farmers got about $2 a year of benefit. Well, you're not going to end poverty that way. And the best way forward was actually agroecology and local food systems. So here you all know what agroecology is, but, and this is too much to read, but basically it's the application of ecological concepts and principles to the design and management of sustainable agroecosystems. They call it the science of sustainable agriculture. And it's not just about practices, alternative practices, it really is about applying practices, applying principles, right, using different practices at the local level, local ecosystems. And it's very much a sort of a social form of agriculture. Extremely productive, extremely successful where it's implemented, and has allowed many farmers in the global south, a movement that I was associated with called farmer to farmer, campesino campesino. For example, about 250,000 farmers adopted these principles and practices and spread it farmer to farmer throughout Central America, pulling themselves out of the Green Revolution, where their soils and livelihoods were being destroyed, on the road to prosperity before the free trade agreements hit. So people push back all over. These farmers push back. We push back here in the United States. The food system appears like it's falling apart, which means it's simply dysfunctional. It doesn't work for us. So people do other things. They try to fix things. And I'm sure many of you are involved in these types of activities. And many people say, well, we've got to fix a broken food system. Well, I disagree. I don't think this food system is broken. I think the food system is working precisely as a capitalist food system in a period of late capitalism is supposed to work. It concentrates power and wealth in the hands of a few monopolies and offloads all of the externalities onto society. It makes us pay. And I'd have to say it's very efficient in that regard. So you can't really get out of it by voting with your fork. If you can vote with your fork, great, but most of the world can't. So the important thing to realize is that it is a capitalist food system. And if it is a capitalist food system, then it's going to act the way capitalism acts. And capitalism always goes through a period of liberalization and a period of reform. When liberalization, the gloves are taken off the market. It's completely deregulated. Does whatever it wants, doesn't have to account for any social or environmental externalities. And things, tremendous amount of wealth is concentrated, and then usually there's a big crash. Like the 1929 crash after the Roaring '20s. And then you can usher in a period of reform, like the New Deal. But you need kind of a special combination of these crises, a certain threat. So in the 1930s, it was communism, right? And so capitalism really had to move quick to really stabilize itself, and Roosevelt was good at that. And there has to be a strong counter-movement. In other words, society has to rise up, as it did in the 30s. Unions were strong, political parties were strong, people took to the streets. It looked as though this country was going to fall. It looked like capitalism was going to fall. A lot of people were in favor of socialism. But that's what it took to introduce reforms. That type of social pressure to create the political will. Otherwise, Roosevelt, nice a guy as he was, would never have been able to do it. He had a famous saying, "That's a great idea, now go out and make me do it," and people did. So if you look at the Great Depression, so you have this period of liberalization during the Roaring '20s, tremendous concentration of wealth, then you have a big crash. But it's accompanied with an ecological disaster called the Dust Bowl. And, 500,000 people went homeless with the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was a result of expanding agriculture into areas where it didn't belong to make money on the market, because we were selling all this food to Europe, who was at war and couldn't produce their own food. But it destroyed the soils. You get the crash. Farmers, a third of farms are foreclosed upon. GDP drops by about 23%. And then a bushel of corn used to buy you 5 gallons of gasoline. And just a couple of years later, it took 2 gallons of gasoline to buy 1 bushel of corn. This is really important because that's where the concept of parity comes in. You're not able to cover your costs with the price of your production. So, after massive protests, FDR introduces the New Deal, and he starts with agriculture, with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was a supply management piece of regulation. The Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation distributed food to people. The Soil Conservation Service tried to repair the effects of the Dust Bowl and prevent the effects of the Dust Bowl in other parts of the Midwest, putting in an extensive terracing system. We controlled monopolies, antitrust laws, we controlled the banks. What's important to realize is that it addressed the whole political economic system, but it recognized the centrality of agriculture. That's the difference. Today, we're not an agrarian society anymore. We don't have 60% of the population, like in the 1930s, on the farm. We have more people in prison today than we have on the farm. So we don't think of ourselves as an agrarian nation. We are, but we're not an agrarian society. So farmers have no power. And most of us don't realize the centrality of agriculture to the rest of the economy. That has not changed as much as we think it has. If you look back at the Roaring '20s, that red line is just a curve I kind of guessed at. But you can see that the Roaring '20s, the GDP increased during the Roaring '20s, then you get this crash, and then during the New Deal, GDP increases even more. So you can see that the reforms, this reformative period, where you control the market and you redistribute resources and wealth, actually leads to a lot more wealth being produced for everybody. And parity is really the key to this. And I think that's what's been missing ever since it was dismantled. It was finally dismantled, especially dismantled, as you can see, with milk now. Parity and supply management and environmentally conditioned parity and supply management. So for example, yes, Farmer John or Farmer Jane, you can grow your food and we're going to give you a price which will cover your cost of production. Government will ensure that price. There are different mechanisms for doing this. But you can only grow so much. You can grow 1,000 bushels and not a bushel more. I'm not going to let you break the market. And you cannot extract more water than gets replenished. You cannot nitrify the waterways. You cannot emit methane, all those things. So they're environmental conditions. So farmers under those conditions are like, oh, well, I'm not going to break my back on this. Getting the price, maybe I can leave some land aside. Have a few woodlots, maybe grow some grass-fed beef. So we get the Green New Deal today after almost 40 years of neoliberalization. And it's really kind of extraordinary. And what's really extraordinary is just how much traction it's gotten. You have this junior congresswoman from the Bronx who suddenly has set the entire world on fire and introduces this Green New Deal. And I think it's great. It's just a resolution, it's not a law yet, and it's really wide open. They don't really say much about agriculture. I think now is the time to recognize that the food system is pivotal. And we have to make sure that we get supply management, and that we get parity, and that we get environmental conditions into the Green New Deal. I mean, if we're really serious about transforming our food system, if we're serious about equity and access and sustainability, here is our chance. Now, I have no idea if this thing is how far this is going to go. No one knows. But one thing is for sure, it's a tremendous opportunity to build a powerful social movement, which is what we need if we're going to make any changes at all. So we could have a working class, multiracial movement for farm, food, and climate justice, for a just transition. And whether or not this is the mechanism, we don't know, but we need that movement. We need people who are not farmers, and many farmers, quite frankly, to remember or to learn what parity is, what supply management is. Because it's overproduction which is driving so much of this. And if we don't control it, the rest of the regulations won't really make that much of a difference. So, can we feed the world without destroying it? Yes, but we're going to have to change everything. Thank you. Okay.
We have a mic floating around and we can afford you speaking with that here. Questions or comments or?
Hi. I was just wondering how you would reconcile the need for all of the expansion of population of the people who need jobs with the increase in technology to suit the needs of all of these people who also now need jobs. Like, what would be, in your opinion, the best way to kind of, I guess, juggle both of those needs to suit the ecological requirements to sustain for a growing population and also for individual needs?
Great question. So, the countryside has been hollowed out in this country because there's CAFOs, enormous plantation farms with just monocultural crops. And which need very sophisticated mechanization. It's just going this one direction, right? But if we were to apply supply management and environmental controls and parity pricing, there would be no reason to get so big. And you could implement agroecological methods of food production, which are knowledge intensive and much more labor intensive. So it would take more people. What we really need to do is repopulate the countryside. I know the modernist environmentalists say we have to leave the countryside, live in the cities, it's more efficient, right? Bullshit. We need to repopulate the countryside. We need to make the countryside a good place to live. We need to make it an attractive place to make your stake and have a livelihood, which means we need good health, education, and welfare services in the countryside, which means that society has to invest in the countryside, which would mean, if we had all those things, public goods, then farmers wouldn't have to ask for as much money for their crops and could pay their workers better. And basically reversing the agrarian transition, right, and sending it the other way. With parity, that food dollar, that crop dollar, circulates up to 7 times locally. Last time we had parity pricing, it only increased the cost of food by 2 or 3%, or 3 to 5% for consumers, because Roosevelt did not let the retailers gouge. He controlled them for a while. So, it would bring more jobs to the countryside, those dollars in the countryside could be reinvested in many different types of activities. I mean, you think about, we make a big deal today about, composting and repurposing food waste and whatnot. Food waste would be reduced dramatically, but that food waste that was there would be, for local businesses to deal with. You can have startups and repurpose it locally. So I think that it's a much more socialistic way of looking at production. But let's remember that we've got a lot of socialism already. I know it doesn't feel like it because we're in a period of neoliberalization, but this system would not work were it not for the social relations between all of us. Those things and services that we do for each other, which are not commodified, if we had charged for all those things, the capitalist system would collapse. So it's tipping the balance in terms of our social activities and our capital activities.
Is the microphone supposed to be used? We might also think about doing some farming in the cities. There's plenty of land available, and places where you can put raised beds, especially where the land has been polluted right now from previous use. Get all that wasted space working again, and that would provide jobs in the city, and would also allow the cities to grow their own fresh, good, nutritious food, which I think they actually enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see this happening. People trying to do it, but what we would like is, a regulatory framework which actually privileges this activity. So you don't have to be an NGO and beg a foundation for money so that you can establish a garden and all that stuff. In fact, society would finance that.
Can you hear me okay, or is it carried? Any suggestions you have to enable investors, wealth managers? Gotcha.
Yeah, thanks. It should be on.
Any way that you envision a way to get capital controllers, essentially, wealth managers, to invest in local agriculture and realize any kind of rate of return that would entice them to do that?
No, there is no rate of return. There's no ROI for agriculture for an investor unless you exploit people or the land. So people are doing this. There are a number of people who are investing in agriculture, but they're content to get 2 to 3% return. They just don't want to lose their money, but they're not out for 40%, which is what finance needs, So right now it's a moral initiative on the part of individual investors to find agricultural projects to invest in and just accept low rates of return. I imagine, I don't know about this, I imagine one could create legislation in which you would have a partnership, private-public partnerships for investment where the government would lay down some money to attract investors, and maybe the philanthropic sector could also put some money on the table, so you have sort of a tripartite investment worth putting into the Green New Deal. Karl Marx.
What are your thoughts about the rise of the impact investing and maybe the possibilities it has on kind of breaking down our broken link-made policies in terms of, when the back was saying, looking at smart investments that are being put in place that are looking at good social and environmental returns, but still with that kind of return moving back. Do you think that's still necessarily always going to be exploitative?
You mean abroad?
Yeah.
So the problem abroad is that it's worse than here because, sort of destroyed these agroecosystems, destroyed these villages, destroyed these societies. This is the problem when people try to invest in the inner city. These economies have been destroyed. And then you invest and you want a triple bottom line. And no, they can't make it, You need investment in schools, you need investment in healthcare, you need all these things which do not respond well to the market before you can even begin to think on getting a decent return on your investment in agriculture. Farmers who are starving, who have no education, who have no healthcare, to expect that you're going to invest with them and that they're going to make enough money to be able to cover those costs from a destroyed health system, from a destroyed educational system, and pay the investors is just unrealistic. We need to rebuild these economies, and investors who expect a return of over 3% are fooling themselves. Yes. As people are leaving, I have to put out a plug for Food First. I don't know if any of you would like these slides. You're perfectly welcome to that. However, you must subscribe to Food First. And so if you go online, I'm going to put them up in a day or so. And if you go online and you subscribe to Food First, then you get these slides. And the reason is we're kind of like public radio. We don't get money from the big foundations. We don't get money from the government or from corporations or from any investors. Unlike and so we basically get money from our subscribers. And even though a lot of those guys are free riders, they get all our stuff and they don't contribute any money. Even if you give us $5 a year, we will be eternally grateful to you for supporting Food First. That's how we've made it this far. And that's how I hope we make it in the future.
So you made it pretty clear, based on the past two comments, in my mind at least, that markets are not the best way to produce food if the goal is feeding people healthy foods. And I know you've done some writing in looking at food as a commons, and I just wondered if you could just talk on that.
So let me clarify that I think we need markets.
So
We do need markets. The problem is when you commoditize food under a liberal regime, then there's no control over markets. And there is no way to ensure that people can express demand. So if you can't express demand, you go hungry. So markets have been around before capitalism. There has to be forms of exchange, but they can't, in my mind, they cannot be completely unregulated. So I'm very much against unregulated markets. So we need some form of market. It doesn't mean that we don't barter. It doesn't mean that we can't have food as a commons. What I wrote with Ilya van Lammeren on the commons, came out of a book about the commons, the food commons, was actually kind of a critique of that notion. People think about the commons as, this belongs to everybody and we're all good. Farmers invest a lot of labor and resources in producing food, so they have to be recognized for that. Just to say that it's free, it's not an option. And now there's lots of different arrangements. You look at CSAs, for example. That's an example of a market which is agreed upon between the producer and the consumer. And there are rules, very strict rules, designed to protect both. And I can give many examples of how CSAs help protect the farm system and really construct food sovereignty in communities as a result of that. During the Spanish Republic, the collectives, the anarchist collectives that took over the big plantations, gave their food to the anarchist industrial unions in the cities with a chit, whatever. And the industrial unions provided industrial goods to those agricultural collectives and guns. And they were the ones who held off the fascist advance for as long as they did because of that alliance and because they were able to decommodify food in a way which served their immediate and their strategic objectives. So I think that there are different forms of commoning. Kind of a global commons, I think, is probably not a good thing. But I think creating a framework for local commons, like CSAs, I think is excellent.
The problem with local CSAs in this system is that they don't make enough money. Health insurance, they don't make enough money to send their kids to school, college, or whatever, so that, I agree, it's a wonderful type of an operation, really, a non-capitalist type of relationship, but within a capitalist society, which makes it so difficult for them to really get a parity type of an income.
I agree completely, which is why we have to change the rules. We're always at a disadvantage, even with these very clever arrangements, that we're pushing back with CSAs or farmers markets and this and that. If we don't change the structural rules, they're not going to be sustainable. Very interesting CSA in the Basque Country, where, in Spain you still have, free education and free healthcare and these things. And so the Basques, because they're Basques, have these CSAs, and the Basque Farmers Union runs the CSA. They have a monopoly on the CSAs in Guipúzcoa. So you want to start a CSA, you got to go talk to the Basque Farmers Union. And they will give you 30 boxes. They call them canastas, they call them baskets. Because they've determined that with 30 baskets you can make a living using hoop houses and whatnot. And you can make a living given their social conditions in which the government pays for all these other things. And you can't get 31 baskets, right? So one farmer's hoop houses blew down one time, and he couldn't provide his baskets to his members. So the other farmers in the union each gave him a basket every week, so he could provide the 30 baskets. So he got his income, his members got their food, and on weekends they went and they rebuilt his hoop houses. This is a form of crop insurance and consumer insurance from within the farmers' union. I think about if that had happened in my county in California, man, all the other farmers would have gobbled up those, made a scramble for those boxes, right? Oh, too bad for you. Your greenhouses blew down. I'll take those members. Thank you very much. So, if we have a farmers' union, it's a whole different story. It's really a different, a different social arrangement around production and consumption, which, they still have to deal with capitalism, and no, they're not doing well, but people are trying, but I think they're all being in the union, they're very clear about changing the rules. It's a little bit different through the EU, it's a different story. But that just means that farmers, there aren't enough of them to change anything. The only way they can do it is if they ally with us. I'm assuming most of you are consumers. These are the alliances that might create the political will to make the changes that we need.
So you've mentioned changing the rules, and my question is, where do you begin, or how do you lobby the people who make the rules to change a structural system like the one we have in place in the United States, for example? I know with the Green New Deal, there's been a lot of political backlash because people don't think it's possible, or they think it will destroy the economy, etc. So how do you go about convincing people that it might be successful?
Education. I mean, we've been miseducated, and ideologically miseducated. So I'm speaking as a head of a think tank, right? And I think we have to change the way we think, which means better information and analysis. And I think it means a lot of listening to frontline communities about what is wrong and how we need to change things. I think a lot of the insight and the perspective comes from being engaged, being active, being with the front lines. I mean, university education is a great thing. I really value what I learned at the university, but the only way to figure out how to put that knowledge to use is to get to work. And there is no other way. I mean, there is no magic sort of place to start even. But it does appear that there's a strategic opening just with this Green New Deal and how much buzz it's created. So it makes sense what we're trying to do is use this moment to educate as much as possible. I couldn't talk about parity a year ago. Now I can talk about parity. I couldn't talk about capitalism 3 years ago. And now I have a book out with foodies and capitalism in the same title. So I'd like to think that we're getting somewhere. But I really don't think there's any other way than to become educated and politicized and organized. We've been seduced to thinking that things can happen on Facebook. I mean, there can be a facilitator. Twitter and Facebook and texting and all that can be a facilitator, but that's not where the real things happen. And I do think that the food system is an excellent place to do this. I mean, even the farmer's market is an excellent place to begin to do this. I mean, don't just have a transactional relationship with the farmers at the market. Have a political relationship. Have a social relationship. Become friends. I mean, I think it has to go just beyond this sort of market transaction. Otherwise, it won't be politically relevant, and that's what we need. I appreciate all you staying so long.
Eric, it seems like one thing that everybody can agree, no matter their perspective, is that the current food regime has done a really good job of getting people out of the business of farming, at least in the developed world. Some people have been historically really positive about that trend. And certainly you can think about that it would be hard in a society where 95% of people are farmers to have universal access to healthcare and education. But of course, we have an agenda right now from the current food regime that we're continuing the process of each year in the United States we need to have fewer and fewer farmers. I doubt that very many people who see themselves as, for instance, very supportive of the current administration would say, oh yeah, America would be great if there were half as many farmers 20 years from now, even though that's where we're going. But I'm interested in if we are on the same page that we don't need farming to be more labor productive in the global north, and we probably need it to be less labor productive, at least in terms of pounds of food per person. Whether there are any places in the world where we feel like farming should be more labor productive, and how we would tell, and what that might mean.
Yeah. So I was just with the Wisconsin Farmers Union last month, I guess. And they would agree with you. Right? No, we don't need to intensify anymore. We've got to get rid of these CAFOs. We've got to dismantle these CAFOs. We need to reinvest in the countryside. We need to sort of downsize the technology, not upgrade to these satellite systems and precision agriculture, because that just means big, big, big. And they don't want that. They want their communities back. I don't know if it's like that here, but you drive through the Midwest and you just see all these old barns and stuff, and there's nobody there. It's sad. And you drive with folks from there, yeah, that used to be so-and-so's place, that used to be so-and-so's place. So they want to repopulate the countryside. In terms of areas that are less sort of technologically developed, I mean, there are very simple technologies to reduce drudgery that people need. and we're really welcome, that don't cost that much money and could really help. So it's not, I'm not against technology. I'm just against this sort of technology which leads us down this path of no return. The global north should finance that. Yeah, we absolutely should. And we should stop dumping all the food over there and driving them out of business. There clearly has to be a period of transition, different periods, different transitions, and has to be sort of tailored to each place. But yeah, there's just a tremendous amount that could be done. And a lot of people are going back to the countryside in the third world because they got nowhere else to go. There isn't a new industrial revolution to sock up all this labor. If we empty the countryside, where is a third of humanity going to go? You think things look bad now with immigration and interracial tension and ethnic tension? Just wait. So I think there are many creative ways to stabilize income in the countryside, to reconstruct the countryside, to regenerate the agro-ecosystems in the countryside and the different networks and local markets and whatnot. But right now, if you talk to the FAO or the World Bank, they're all about getting these farmers into the global market, which is certain death, and they know that. They talk about land mobility. That doesn't mean the land moves; it means the farmer moves off the land. So we have to reverse all of that, and the FAO has to stop with these fairy tales that it tells and that it offers. Again, I think it means us linking with the social movements in the global south. They'll let us know what they want, and we can talk about, well, how can we be a part of this? If you have a question after we finish, I'm glad to stick around.
I just have a question about, I think the Green New Deal is very interesting indeed, but I'm curious to know what other movements you're watching and feeling inspired by or feeling...
Sure. Oh, by the way, I brought a few of these books, about 10 of these books. If anybody wants to buy a book, I'll sign it. I don't want to lug them all the way back to California. Okay, so Via Campesina is a very important federation, farmers' federation. Several million farmers belong to, that has advanced the concept of food sovereignty, which has just taken off around the world. It's kind of extraordinary how people have latched onto it. It's probably one of the foremost anti-capitalist concepts to come across since communism. So it's very important there. I would say that the food, farm, and climate justice movements are sort of poised to establish powerful strategic alliances, and they are already weighing in on the Green New Deal. So the climate justice movement has refrained from endorsing the Green New Deal. It's very interesting, we like where it's going, but you need this, and it's A, keep the oil in the ground. B, don't take the water from indigenous people. Just really basic things. Then maybe we'll sign on to the Green New Deal. Otherwise, we're not going to sign. Wisconsin Farmers Union came out supportive, or the National Farmers Union came out very positive on the Green New Deal, but hasn't endorsed it. You can put parity in there, you can put supply management in there, then maybe we'll sign on. The problem is these voices, while these are activist voices, and they're very important, but they're not loud enough because not enough people know about them. So these are actually very promising sort of movement. There's a very promising movement among the movements, which I think we have to be a part of. We have to reach out to and support in any way which is appropriate.